All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? Last week, of course, we reviewed Michael Collins, a movie about the revolutionary Irish Republican hero. But you know what? That movie didn't really talk too much about the north of Ireland, which is unfortunately still part of the UK. But to them, they're totally okay with it. There's never been any strife over there. There's never been any great art that came out of Northern Ireland that talked about the conflict. Oh, wait a second.
No, they're so happy to be there. They have such a good life there that the empire has given them.
Exactly. But Brett, I'm now literally doing 5 seconds of research, and I'm seeing right here that there apparently was a sectarian conflict in the North. Can you believe that? That's ridiculous.
That sounds like fake news.
It does, but apparently also as well, talk about great art, there was apparently a punk band that came out of Northern Ireland called Stiff Little Fingers, and they made an album about the troubles, like maybe it was a trouble.
The problems, the inconveniences. The inconveniences.
The annoyances.
The annoyances. Oh my God, that's great.
But yeah, so they apparently made an album in 1979 called Inflammable Material, which 1979, I think, Brian, you and I could both agree, was a pretty bad era and year for punk. Would you agree with that?
Kind of. I would say it was mostly a bad era for straightforward punk, because by 79, hardcore is bubbling up and post-punk and art punk is getting really big. But as far as like the classic 76, 77 Pistols, Ramones punk, pretty dire time for that. Most of the bands still doing that are kind of like Johnny-come-latelys, who are kind of older, seasoned musicians who are jumping on it as a costume. So for this particular strand of punk, I would say, yeah, 79 is a pretty bad time.
All right, fair enough. I was actually just being an asshole about it, but I guess it actually probably wasn't.
Oh, sorry. I mean, that's a complicated question, but for like rock and roll punk, yeah, kind of.
But, speaking of punk and complicated questions referring to Northern Ireland, let's get into the review here, which is Inflammable Material by the band Stiff Little Fingers. But before we get into our review this week, Brian, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Generational Cringe Millennial Moment of the Week.
A loser millennial, a dumbass, gay, pussy millennial.
Woo! Yeah!
Okay, so
all right. And you know what, Brian? You sent a message that indicated that you might be the cringe millennial here.
An R-worded mutant millennial who can't remember shit and gets stressed out and confused and forgets dates and times constantly. Yes, Taylor, I am this week's cringe millennial. And I know, Brian, aren't you always cringe? I am specifically the subject of this episode's generational segment. Taylor, this is a very short story and it ties directly into the review of Inflammable Material. But spring, fall, summer of 2019 was probably, just from a traditional metric, the best time of my life. I had a lot of disposable income. I'd started a new job. Everything felt very carefree for me. I also I weighed 120 pounds and I was tan from head to toe. A very good time for me. But it also meant that I was jumping around. I was busy a lot. I was going to a lot of shows because I had so much disposable income, because I was now working full time and I had a roommate for a brief period. I was going to every show in Portland. Any punk show, any experimental show. And 2019 was the 40th anniversary of this album. So Stiff Little Fingers go on this massive tour. They're playing the whole album in its entirety, which is crazy because there's a few songs on here, and we'll get into them in the review. There's a couple songs here that they don't really play live and haven't pretty much ever.
One of them, and once again, before we get to the track listing, I will say I know exactly which song that, in my opinion, they probably shouldn't ever play live again. And it's not their fault. It's just the way things are nowadays.
Well, and we'll get to, there actually is a little bit of how they went about playing it live, but not only was Stiff Little Fingers playing this whole album in its entirety, their opening act was the Avengers, who are this legendary LA punk band. They predate hardcore, and they actually predate the Germs. They're a 77 punk band. So you've got these two, if not OG, very close to OG legendary punk bands, one from Belfast and one from LA. And they kind of represent these two different sides of punk, right? You've got this really kind of glam influenced, kind of artsy LA punk band who are precursor to hardcore. And you've got SLF, who are this very working class, rock and roll oriented kind of populist band. And they were both playing together. I mean, I think it was something like $55 for the ticket. That is more than I usually spend on a ticket.
That's a lot for a punk show in general. Even for a legendary punk band, that's a lot of money.
I think it was $55. It might have been less. maybe I made it bigger in my head in the memory. And I bought it about 6 months ahead. I think it was at the Crystal Ballroom, pretty small venue for bands this legendary. So it would have been fairly intimate and it sold out fast. And then I went on with my life. I dawdled and went to a lot of shows in the meantime because I just went to a lot of shows at that time. And then one night I was sitting down, just scrolling in boredom on Facebook or something. And a mutual friend from Portland like posted video and said, "Oh, seeing SLF right now." And I went, "Wait, what?" And then I had this slow dawning. And the show was going on. Well, I sat on my couch and watched friends of mine post about it on Facebook. I bought the tickets and then didn't even think about it. It just was thrown into the dustbin of my memory. It is still the single biggest regret I have in regards to like seeing live music ever. And that includes leaving the Smashing Pumpkins early because the crowd was bumming me out, which I also regret. It is the single biggest fuck up in my music fan experience.
That is genuinely, I'll be honest, Brian, I feel bad, obviously, because that was something you really wanted to see, but it is very funny. I'm going to be honest.
I still get like frustrated when I think about it because, I mean, the Avengers also, but SLF, not the pivotal band, but a pretty pivotal band for me. I've been listening to this album since middle school. They have a really, just overall, they start out with a really rough, kind of, I think, a more aggro sound than some of the other punk bands from this era. I would say they're kind of more aggressive sounding than, I don't know, like 999 or like even The Clash or something. So I've been listening to this album for a long time, and it never occurred to me until I bought those tickets that I'd probably get to see them and the Avengers, let alone on the same bill.
No, fucking totally. And, speaking of, let's get into the album details here because, Brian, I loved the story, but it was bumming me out. I'm fucking around.
Me too.
Let's get into the details here. So, once again, this is Inflammable Materials. It came out in 1979, as I mentioned before. And the first two trivia facts I had here, well, it's more like one piece of trivia, but it was technically separated into two. But the album was recorded in 1978, mostly at the Spaceward Studios in Cambridge, except for the song Alternative Ulster, which was recorded at Island Studios in London. The process was described by Burns as being done very quickly and as if we were playing a live gig due to the band's lack of knowledge in studio recording, which, to be honest with you, I was kind of surprised about because this album sounds pretty tight for 1970s punk.
It sounds very good. One of the things with this generation of punk is that some of them were a little bit more like, so the guys in Stiff Little Fingers, actually, this is a good point to get into it. They had been in a band previously, like when they were schoolboys in like the earlier 70s, probably from like 73 to, I guess, probably 76 or 77, called Highway Star. That was actually like kind of cock rock. Jake Burns of SLF says, oh, he wanted to be a heavy metal hero. So he is listening to Leonard Skinner. And, the phrase Highway Star, that comes from a Deep Purple song. And of course, as I listened to a lot of interviews with Jake this week, he says, and also he wanted to be Phil Lynott, of course, because he's Irish. And then kind of they start getting sick of that because they're young kids and they're looking for something new. And they were getting into like pub rock, pre-punk. So they were playing for a little bit before the punk thing hit. So, and I think that's where that comes from because this is really tight for like a bunch of teenagers that are into like the Clash and the Ramones.
Yes, 100%. And speaking of, we talked about personnel here. So you mentioned Jake Burns on guitar and vocals. I think he's maybe the only consistent member of the band.
Yeah, that happens with these guys.
Oh, no, absolutely. And in fact, the fact that all of them are still alive is kind of shocking, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I didn't think of that. That's a good point.
Henry Clunny on guitar and vocals, Ali McMorty on bass and vocals, and Brian Falloon on drums. And it was produced by Jeff Travis, Mayo Thompson, Doug Bennett, and Ed Hollis. Now, I think Jeff Travis was the executive at Rough Trade Records. I know one of them was the executive.
Yes, and this is a pretty important record, even beyond punk, just in like rock and roll and pop music. This is the first independent album to debut in the top 20.
Yes, actually, that was the trivia fact, so I'll just go over that right now. But
sorry.
This was no, it's all good. But just clarify, this was the first album on an independent record label to enter the UK top 20, peaking at number 14 in 1979. And on Rate Your Music, before we get to the Rate Your Music thing, it was the 36th highest ranked album for 1979. So people really do like this quite a bit.
Yeah. This is one of those albums, and there's a few albums like this. In punk, there's a series of albums where it's like you can recommend them to someone that's not into the genre, especially in that classic period. And most of them are like the Clash and the Ramones, maybe the Dead Kennedys. But I would say this album is in that category. This is such a perfect encapsulation of like, I guess, a normie's idea of punk rock. And I say that in a positive way. That's also really good.
No, totally. I can't wait and we're not going to do a comprehensive track listing because we both decided that it's not appropriate for the vast majority of albums we'll ever cover on the show. But there obviously are single songs that I do want to highlight on here because I would say at least half the album is like classic, like S-tier punk. At least half this album is, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the album overall is great. And about half the songs on it are amongst, I would say, all-time great punk rock classics.
No, for sure. And then I mentioned Rough Trade Records, which was their record label at the time. And they have a song specifically about how much they love Rough Trade Records.
Well, there is a story about that, a pretty frustrating story. But that song actually isn't about Rough Trade. Rough Trade thought it was very funny that they used their name as a placeholder. Rough Trade actually are, in history, they're more known for like post-punk and like new wave. That's more what they ended up doing. Very influential. A lot of bands started on there. But yeah, their first album put out by Rough Trade was Inflammable Material, which is just classic, kind of straight ahead punk rock and roll, I'd say.
No, for sure. And this album is about 41 minutes and 8 seconds long. And on Amazon, it has a 4.8 out of 5. And on Rate Your Music, it once again has a 3.77 out of 5. So a very critically acclaimed album from both audiences and critics. And then before we get to our not fully comprehensive track listing here, but I do want to highlight some Amazon reviews, Brian, because believe it or not, the Amazon reviews I thought were pretty smart. They were actually very smart, as your selections on the show generally have much smarter Amazon review sections than mine do, which is a funny.
It's interesting.
Like genuinely, whenever you pick something, the Amazon reviews are generally much better than mine.
That's just because I know that I hate hearing the bad reviews, so I pick things that'll spare me.
But I did find one review I wanted to highlight because it is so funny in retrospect. So this is a 20-year-old Amazon review. So at this point, Brian, this guy was like, man, I can't fucking wait for John Kerry to be president. Probably this guy. So Michael Henderson gives this album 5 stars. And the head of the review says, the greatest fire ever recorded. And the body of the review says, let me just start out by saying a few words about a subject that has been beaten to death. People get all worked up today about punk, quote unquote, punk music. And I can't understand why. Bands such as Green Day, Blink-182, and Good Charlotte, New Found Glory, they're not even punk at all. And that's awesome, by the way, because who's thought of Good Charlotte in 20
as punk?
years?
So just because this guy's giving me a natural in, I'm going to say, and I don't listen to any of that shit anymore, I do feel like Green Day deserve to be kind of separated from those other bands.
Oh, 100%. And I don't even like Green Day, by the way, but I fully agree with that, 100%.
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, no. So when people tie on them the ever so tired, quote-unquote, pop-punk label, it gets me a little cranky. Pop-punk? Come on now, children. These aforementioned bands owe far more to the Beatles than any respectable punk band, which, once again, that's not true of Green Day, in my opinion. I think you would probably agree.
No, I mean, I actually think that this album is a primary influence on Green Day, specifically on their album Insomniac, which is famously kind of their messier, tougher sounding record with kind of these scratchy vocals, which I think the production on there is directly inspired by the production on Inflammable Material.
By the way, Brian, I know you'll love this because this is even more punk gatekeeping here. So, Punk UC was born with Iggy Pop and the Stooges.
Punk UC.
Punk UC. It is raw.
I've studied punk academically.
Yeah, political expression, personal expression, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that it is raw, straight from the hip, and reasonably fast, right? Well, if the Stooges birthed that writhing, thrashing beast known as punk, this album crystallized everything that was right about this
were so
genre.
fast. Yeah, the Stooges weren't this muddy, psychedelic mess of a noisy, like, just plodding dirge band. They were so fast. God, this fucking guy doesn't even know what he's talking about.
Brilliant, stunningly fast as savage riffs, tight and hammering rhythm section, and insightful fury-fueled lyrics, and Jake Burns singing. Well, simply put, it's the greatest, nastiest howl you'll ever hear. I don't know if I quite say that, although I do like Jake Burns' vocals quite a bit. I think he's a very good vocalist for this kind of band.
I think Jake has a great voice. He does sound like he's like got razor blades in his throat. One of my thoughts listening to this was that I think he has a much harsher vocal style than other punk bands of the time. Like the way he's vocalizing is kind of would become more common with like American hardcore bands than it was in 79.
No, absolutely.
In my opinion.
And then finishing up the review here, this is punk, good sirs. Once again, this is so millennial. This is so millennial. Beautiful, nasty, and always young punk. It is, in my opinion, along with the Ramones' Rocket to Russia, Television's Marquee Moon, The Clash's London Calling, Mission of Burma's Signals, Calls and Marches, Husker Du's Zen Arcade, and Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures. One of their greatest rock and roll albums ever made. I also love that, by the way, because it reminds me of that guy in the fucking Bone Tomahawk review where he's just like, I've seen all the classic Westerns.
Like, this guy has, like, pretty good taste or whatever, of course, but it's like, I'm just gonna list everything that I like, and it's this super famous stuff within its sphere. Ever heard of Unknown Pleasures?
It stands atop the peak of almost unattainable brilliance, giving us all the middle finger in all its ragged glory. And for that, we are thankful. Children, buy this masterpiece. There'll be time enough for Bach when you're old and can no longer bang your head. So, you know what?
Yeah, everyone's head banging to stiff little fingers.
This is very cringe millennial, and this guy clearly is very dumb when it comes to his punk rock historian label here. But you know what? I still like this review because it made me laugh. Because I saw the 2004, I saw the punk gatekeeping about Good Charlotte, and I'm like, this has got to be something that has to be in the show. This is awesome.
Here's the thing. I kind of believe in gatekeeping about like subcultural music. That's fine. But it's also like, if you're like an adult, like who cares about Good Charlotte and Blink-182?
No,
like,
seriously.
Be concerned with it, you know. Also, like if you're gonna have strong opinions about like the legitimacy of a subculture of music, then you should like know how to talk about it without being like, "Why, hello, good sir, stiff little fingers have won the internet."
Stiff Little Fingers is fucking epic. Like that's...
Stiff Little Fingers are. I don't even know what they'd say. Making me mad, getting in these people's heads.
I say merely epic, good sir. That's all. This owns this album.
I would say Stiff Little Fingers owns, but that's because I'm a cringe millennial. 40 years in, and Inflammable Material still pones my dick.
I literally saw, there was a Onion video, because Onion have been coming out with video content recently, and the one that came out today
for like 20 years.
Well, they did do it consistently for a while, but they actually didn't do a lot of video content for like a solid decade after like the 2012 election cycle, I want to say. So
I haven't read The Onion since 2012.
Well, it's the video content they're getting back into, not the actual like articles and stuff like that. But there was one today where it was like Greg Abbott employs like awkward guys to block the border or something like that. And I was like, yo, yeah, they made cringe millennials show up to the border to turn away fucking migrants.
That's pretty good.
Just be a guy with a neck beard being like, hey, you want to see my Funko Pop collection?
Trying to enter the country, methinks not.
But, you know, speaking of somebody who for sure has issues with our border policy, so Murat's Bathing gives us 5 stars. And the head of the review says, this album is perfect. Why are SLF practically unknown? And the body of the review says,
they're not.
They're really not. But to be fair,
like,
to a certain type of person, they are absolutely an unknown band.
Like, I know there's a type of person who's going to listen to this because they aren't like a famous band to just like, but like, no, if you're into like punk music, even if you're like into indie rock of a certain area, like you probably know SLF. They're not unknown.
No,
especially not in Ireland. Like,
no, Jesus Christ, no. But the body of the review says, this is one of my favorite punk albums of all time, yet a disturbingly few amount of people know who the hell SLF are. Well, as you obviously said, Brian, that's not quite true. But that's if you
maybe
like
this is like a kid who doesn't know many people that are into punk and he's getting into it, you know.
Oh, yeah, he could be like a teenager. If that's the case, then, you know, good on you. You're doing your part.
Because that's how I felt when I was listening to this.
This guy's like a 43-year-old elderly millennial. This Doug Walker.
Nobody knows what I know.
Yeah.
He's like going on dates being like, I bet you've never heard of Stiff Little Fingers, to like a chick with like a crass patch.
He's like, I finally got my goth GF to show up. Do you know about SLF?
Flecks of Pink Indians? Is that an indie pop band? Huh.
Yeah. Not like you know, but no. We're just making fun of who we were at one point. No, I'm just kidding.
We're making fun of ourselves.
Yeah.
I was.
If you like the Clash or the Sex Pistols, you will love SLF, no doubt. Which I feel like is kind of true. I definitely hear some Clash in here.
No. Oh, so actually, another good point to bring up. One of the things that I heard Jake say repeatedly is, you know, he was into moving away from heavy metal and getting into pub rock and glam rock, looking for something different. Punk rock happens, and he likes it at first. He likes the Sex Pistols and the Damned. He hears the Damned first, then he hears the Pistols, then he likes them, but he thinks they're kind of funny and kind of exciting musically, but he doesn't really care about it, right? But by his own account, he heard the Clash. He heard their lyrics and how they were just writing about their lives, you know, and about like living in like the streets of London. And he immediately thought, oh, this is what I need to do. And he stopped playing like hard rock and heavy metal and was like, well, I need to write songs about Belfast because that's the Clash have now shown me that that's what you do. Yeah, no, I would agree. If someone is a fan of that era of punk, then this is essential listening. That British thing, that very populist kind of angsty speaking truth to power thing. Yeah, this is almost up there with the first Clash album in that style.
No, exactly. And also coming from a literal war zone at the time, too. I mean, really.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Stiff Little Fingers is a band from Belfast, Ireland, a place of many troubles around the time of this record's release in 1979. You think? And there's
a place of many annoyances.
Many annoyances. Reflect all of this suffering. They were rebels with a cause, trying to give hope to the masses in Northern Ireland, and they used some damn good punk rock music to spread their messages. Everyone who knows of SLF are quick to call them, quote-unquote, the Irish Clash. Well, as much as I like the Clash, I'd have to say that I enjoy listening to SLF quite a bit more. Here's the thing, right, is that even though I did like this album, I still like the Clash more. I mean, I don't like Cut the Crap or whatever, but, you know, they're classic, fucking early,
everything
80s.
else they did.
London Calling shit, 100%. Like, yeah, they are like an almost unbeatable band in like fucking early 80s like punk music. So I mean, it's really not fair to say that, but still.
I agree, like 100% with that. Part of that might be like I heard the Clash even before I heard SLF. They were one of the first punk bands, like with most people. And I mean, I'm gonna be honest, the Clash have informed a large part of my life, along with other punk bands like that. A big part of my current politics kind of start with hearing the Clash. Like that's that's the thing that made me start reading all the shit I read and following the news. But when I have heard other people say they like SLF, I've heard people say SLF are their favorite band, Inflammable Material is their favorite album. I think that's a defendable take. What's interesting is their trajectory of SLF is very different from the Clash. They put out 3 albums after this that are all really good, and they get really melodic, and they really play up their like Thin Lizzy influence, I'd say, and their kind of folk influence, as opposed to like how the Clash did their reggae thing.
Yes.
So I agree with you. To me, the Clash are pretty much unimpeachable. Like, I mean, SLF are in that tier, but they're not as good as the Clash to me. I don't think it's like crazy for someone to say that, especially maybe you get burnt out on the Clash, you know, and you want more of that, but different. You know, SLF are a good choice.
No, exactly. Like, listen, if somebody was like, I don't get the appeal of fucking...
Well, Clash sucks.
Of the Clash.
That's fucking poser music.
Well, if somebody was like, I don't get the fucking Clash, SLF are much better, and they'd only heard Cut the Crap, I'd be like, okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
Cut the Crap
is
how
that person wouldn't
album.
exist. Cut the Crap does have This Is England, which is like a top 5 Clash song.
That is, and it's also pretty much the only song on that album that anybody has any reverence for. Otherwise, that is pretty much completely forgotten.
It's terrible.
Album.
It's embarrassing. The band itself disregarded it.
No, exactly. And then the last sentence here is, this is one of my personal favorite punk rock albums, and if you're into punk at all, or if you simply happen to be a Clash fan, I give Inflammable Material my highest recommendation. And you know what? I agree with this review, obviously, a lot more than the last one, where the guy was just being a really dumb gatekeeper and not even an accomplishment.
Being a loser, yeah.
Yeah. So those are our Amazon reviews, and let's get into the track listing here. Now, like I said, we're not going to do a comprehensive one because it'll just take way too fucking long, but obviously I want to talk about certain tracks, and the first track here is definitely one we have to talk about, which is Suspect Device. Fantastic fucking song. This might, in my opinion, even be my favorite song in the album. I think it's a great intro to this album.
This is a great intro. It's a great mission statement for the band. Right off the gate, we've got lyrics. Like, Jake Burns clearly took to heart when he heard the Clash and felt like they were writing about their lives. He really took that to heart. And I don't think he was necessarily thinking, I need to write about the troubles because it's just like, he was like, well, what do I have anxiety about in my life? And Suspect Device, even the phrase Suspect Device is very specifically a reference to the troubles. I mean, musically, it is like a classic punk song. It's charged. It's got a catchy, chorus that you can sing along to and bop your head to, but it's like got rough aggression to it. But just as a mission statement, it's of course a reference to bombs, Suspect Device. And then, not to get too on its face with it, the idea is that like we're a suspect device, like you as like this kid, and that is very nebulous here. Stiff Little Fingers, at least on this album, they are both anti-empire and anti-IRA. I'm going to say that's the way they present themselves. And this doesn't necessarily line up with my specific politics, but what I'm going to say is what punk in Ireland is about, and very explicitly to Stiff Little Fingers, was about like creating an alternative for kids in Ireland, saying like you don't have to be in war and go like there's more possibility for your life than to fight in a war if you don't want to, which I do think is like a noble thing to say, and that is very explicitly laid out in Suspect Device and other songs throughout the album.
Yes, and some of those include Wasted Life, State of Emergency. You got
no more of
no
that.
More life.
Yeah, I mean
Well, I think there's only one. Well, obviously Barbed Wire Love is a classic. That song is great because I love the like 50s like doo-wop fucking like song.
Oh, I'm so excited to get there. That was the first Stiff Little Finger song I ever heard.
We went through obviously the motifs of like the first 4 or 5 songs. So yeah, let's get into Barbed Wire Love, which is great. It's a song, obviously. The metaphor is war and love. It's obviously a very well-worn metaphor. But like I said, I love the doo-wop like 50s interlude here. It's fucking fantastic. It's so funny.
I do have little bits throughout for the next. So Suspect Device, our opening track beats out. That leads into State of Emergency. The one thing I want to say about this, because it's a pretty, not that it's bad, it's great, but it's a punk song. One of the things that State of Emergency showcases that you don't see a lot in this album is their Thin Lizzy influence. There's this really kind of red hot finger picking lead guitar that it intros with that is like not like a punk guitar. It's very like cock rocky. It's got this very cascading kind of rhythm section, this kind of galloping dun, 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 which is a thing you'd see from Lizzy a lot. The Clash and Thin Lizzy or Stiff Little Fingers too, like on their face, big influences. But there's only a couple moments on this album where you see the Lizzy influence, and one of those is State of Emergency. Now I do want to say Here We Are Nowhere is, and this is a take I don't see a lot, probably my second or third favorite song on the album. Here We Are Nowhere is about 58 seconds long. It's just really fast, really bass driven, a big rockabilly influence. You know, there's a couple moments where it's this kind of 50s rock retro thing pops in. One of those is Here We Are Nowhere, where it's, yeah, like rockabilly cranked up to 11. But lyrically, on its face, it's about being bored, like on Friday or Saturday night. But really, I think it's about this feeling of being young and like resigned to like death and like poverty. It's like Here We Are Nowhere. It's this idea that you're a kid and you've reached the end of your life, basically, which I know is just a really simple, sad way to feel about your reality that I think a lot of people in Ireland were feeling at that time. Of course, that leads into Wasted Life, which is the same themes as Suspect Device, but I'd say it does them as well. Wasted Life, just a very bitter anti-war screed that again is just like Suspect Device, screaming about needing an alternative, like the option to choose something other than war. No More of That is one of my least favorite tracks on there. It's kind of the same themes as you said, Taylor. But Barbed Wire Love, I'm glad you like it because it's my favorite Stiff Little Fingers song.
So I'll be honest, I don't think it's my favorite on this album. I would say it's probably like my second or third favorite. It is a great fucking song though, for sure. Like I think Suspect Device is my favorite just because I obviously love the length of it. I think it's a great intro. And then on top of it, I just love the lyrics are great. Like I said, I love when he goes, you know, Suspect Device. I love that. It's just such a good, like, that's
a classic punk chant thing.
Yeah. It's just like a perfect hardcore punk song in all honesty.
Well, for me, I guess Barbed Wire Love, first of all, like I said, first Stiff Little Fingers song I heard. I'm a millennial. I learned about punk through like reading books from the school library and then just downloading stuff from the internet. And Barbed Wire Love was the first Stiff Little Fingers song I found. And it's not like necessarily a great representation of their sound in retrospect, but it's so catchy. And so since I was a kid, I like loved it. I loved the doo-wop angle, which when I listen to it in the context of the album is really interesting because it kind of hints at some of their sophistication. You know, pretty much every other track, right, is just this blistering punk song other than maybe their Bob Marley cover. But they kind of, you know, Barbed Wire Love, it's a little bit longer, 3.5 minutes. It's got vocal harmonies. Of course, it's got like a very easy to play, not like a prog tempo shift, but it's got a tempo shift. It kind of indicates where they would go on their next few albums a little bit, I think.
Interesting. Okay, because this is the only SLF I've ever heard. I'm going to be honest with you. So that does sound interesting.
I think that you might... So this is my favorite SLF album, but just knowing what I know about your taste, you might like their second and third album even more.
Okay.
Because it's a little bit more... It's a little tighter, and it's a little bit more overtly musical.
Interesting. I'll certainly give that a listen because, like I said, I liked this album quite a bit. As I usually do like your album picks quite a bit, but this is another one that I liked quite a bit.
Yeah, I had a feeling you'd like this, given, you know, we're talking about the Troubles lately. So I was like, oh, what's a thing that we can... I figured this would be an interesting thing to add a little bit of, like, emotional texture to it.
Oh, no, for sure. And then, you know, speaking of things that I don't like, obviously, outside of the context of this, but the context works, but White Noise, which is the prequel to Guilty of Being White, I think, in a lot of ways. No, I'm fucking around. That was the first thought that I had in my mind. I'm like, this is an anti-racist song that people would think is racist nowadays if they don't pay attention. Is. But that was the sole connection. I don't think it's actually quite like that.
So I found out that when they played this song, they stopped playing this song until that 40th anniversary that I missed, that I had tickets to see, where they played this whole album. When they started playing that, Jake Burns started giving like a preface live and saying like, hey, this is what this song is about. And he said he had to, because there were so many people. The audience for his band had gotten so much bigger and everyone's filming things on their phone. You know, not all kids from Northern Ireland who you can assume are familiar with the type of oppression they're talking about. And he was like, I need to say what this is about, because if it is cut from the context of the album where we're performing it in any way, it becomes so nasty.
And to be clear, this is an anti-racist song where the lead character is basically saying, hey, you guys hate people in your local community, but the British forces are calling us the subhumans. So what the fuck are you talking about? Like, that's basically what it is. And there's a lot of slurs in this song, to be clear. So that's what, I'm not going to repeat any of the lyrics here.
But so every verse is, you know, explicitly like screed of racial slurs and just horrible things you say to say about another human being, black people and brown people. And finally come around for circle with like a verse about like like Irish people. Now, the chorus of this, if you know SLF are Irish and you know to distinguish between the Irish and the English, I think it's pretty clear because the chorus of the song is like, your face don't fit, you ain't no Brit. But how many Americans distinguish between Irish and English to begin with?
Well, that's what we were talking about on the Michael Collins episode, because like a lot of Americans might watch Michael Collins and be like, oh yeah, it's just two British people fighting each other. And it's like, no, that's not really what
No, they're not. No. But I just feel like if you know SLF are Irish and you hear white noise, if you know anything about the relationship, if we can call it that, between the British and the Irish, you kind of can take the phrase, you know, your face don't fit, you ain't no Brit, pretty clearly for what it is. I mean, this song to me is probably Jake Burns. What I think is maybe you heard some Irish kids saying racist things about black and brown people and kind of was thinking like, hey, you're basically carrying water for like the empire that treats us this same way. You know, like I hate to overuse the word, but you're normalizing the behavior that leads to you being treated like that, you know, which I've never heard Jake Burns say that explicitly, but my feeling is that that's what white noise is about. I realize that the atmosphere is different as far as like white people ironically using slurs or whatever. I mean, I'm white, so I guess my take doesn't really matter on this. I think the context, and you know, if you're listening to this album, hopefully, you know, I think the context is pretty clear, but I understand that some people just don't like hearing those words. They don't think there's any reason for Jake Burns to be saying them. You know, I get it. It is one of my favorite songs on the album, though.
Exactly. You know, it's one of those things where, you know, just like obviously pretty much any anti-bigoted song or movie or whatever, like I can understand why some people it might be triggering for them or it just might not be what they're looking for. I totally get it. But people want to say this is racist or whatever. It is not. Just because it has slurs doesn't make it racist. I think we're very clear on that.
It is a very clear point when you're like listening to it. And, you know, maybe people hear those words and they don't want to listen to it. Sure, that's their prerogative. You know, I don't know, man.
It's not like Bill Maher dropping the N-word on his show. It's not like that.
No, just to prove he can do it.
Yeah. All right. And then, so next song here, and of course, like I said, we're not going to go in-depth 15 minutes on every song, obviously. But the next one on here is Breakout. This is also a fantastic song. This one,
Breakout,
you know, just
good.
Yeah, classic song about wanting to be free and breaking out from the mediocrity of modern life. You know, it's a pretty well-worn topic, once again, in popular song making, but I think they do a pretty good rendition of it.
This is a great kind of classic punk type song, like most of the songs on this album. It's another one, kind of like Here We Are Nowhere, where it kind of has a little bit of a 50s rockabilly vibe, especially on the bass. One of the things that sticks out to me about this is Jake Burns' vocals. He's doing a little bit more of a Joey Ramone thing, a little bit less of the gargling on Broken Glass thing and more of a like, you know, just kind of a lower kind of, you know, I don't know how to put it, like a dumb guy voice a little bit, which is interesting for it to hear him trying out.
No, totally. I totally know what you mean on that, which is, you know, interesting. Obviously, you know, Joey Ramone is obviously a very iconic, like, punk vocalist, so I can see why. Exactly, yeah.
And the thing that you end up, that I think you might be getting at is he has a very distinct voice within punk, even as influential as he is. Not many people sing in that way. Most of them do the Johnny Rotten bleh kind of thing, which is closer to what Jake does on this album. But here he is trying out that more classic kind of rock and roll punk sound, and that's fun.
No, exactly. And, you know, obviously to bring it back to a segment that we just did a few months back at this point, but the nu metal thing, right? Like, you know, even though nu metal or Korn, I should say, Korn was a very influential nu metal band. Not a lot of nu metal bands sounded like Korn. Practically none of them did. Unless they were on like Korn's, like their minor record label they had at the time.
Right.
Or they were touring with Korn. None of them really sounded like Korn, which is very interesting.
Well, one of the things I think about a lot, I think about it usually in regards to like punk music, right? But it's true of a lot of genres. So the way that Stiff Little Fingers say they basically got serious and formed serious as a punk band because of the Clash. What you see with the genres a lot is the first artists to take up that style, they're influenced by the first artists to do it, but not necessarily by their music, but just by their existence. Like how there's dozens of bands that come out because they see the Sex Pistols in like 75, 76, 77. And they're all like, well, we had to be a band because of the Sex Pistols. We had to be a band because of the Clash. But then you listen to them and they only sound kind of like vaguely like those bands, because it's not like they heard that we're like, we need to sound like them. It was just like the existence of this new music, like just them existing made them want to start a band. And I think you see that in other genres. Like I actually was thinking about that in regards to nu metal, how I think that there were probably a lot of metal bands in the 90s that didn't know what to do, and when they hear Korn, they're like, okay, a little bit of funk, a little bit of rap, not necessarily that they want to sound like Korn, but that kind of gives them a blueprint for something they can do that's different, right?
No, absolutely. And, once again, I love nu metal. And of course, a lot of bands were able to do that in interesting ways. Some of them, of course, very cringy ways. And one of these days, I think we should go back into the nu metal canon and actually try to find more classic era nu metal albums that a lot of people don't talk about. I know that's obviously a thing that people
I've
are
thought
doing,
about
but
that as well. Also, in regards to bands sounding like Korn, the only band I can think of that seemed to explicitly sound like Korn is that first Coal Chamber album, which is basically like Korn if they had a sense of humor, right?
Yes, that is a really good way to put it. Like Loco and stuff like that.
Big Truck.
Big Truck. I can definitely hear that. I could definitely hear it. Also, Edema
Even the
tried
production.
something like Korn, but that was a specific thing because Edema's vocalist was literally Jonathan Davis's half brother, so they were trying to purposely. And also, a lot of the members in that band were actually in Sex Art, so that makes a lot of sense too.
Oh, see, I've never listened to Edema.
They're not a great band, in my opinion. They're a pretty, I would say, B and C tier nu metal band. But like I said, it's obvious they're trying to ape that because a lot of the members, like I said, were in Sex Art, and their vocalist was literally Jonathan Davis's brother.
It reminds me of like Power Man 5000, where you listen to it and then you learn it's Rob Zombie's brother, and you're like, oh, he sounds just like him.
Yeah,
it's just worse.
Well, speaking of, you sent me that playlist of like early White Zombie stuff.
Early White Zombie cooks so hard.
It was good. It was genuinely really good. I only had time to listen to like 3 or 4 songs, but it was really fucking good, honestly.
White Zombie, straight up. I know people even know that they're like early 90s stuff, which is this heavy kind of mix of like kind of fast paced, almost like punk tempos and groove metal. That's good. But before that, like they were like a noisy post punk band. Like they came out of the New York no wave scene with fucking like Glenn Branca and Sonic Youth. No joke. So you listen to that, it came from NYC Comp, which is all their early singles and EPs. They fucking sound like the Birthday Party or something. It's crazy.
It was. I genuinely wasn't expecting it. I'm like, oh my God. I did not know Rob Zombie didn't do anything other than butt rock vocals.
No, it's straight up
what Rob Zombie does for butt rock. Because Rob Zombie does a lot of butt rocky type stuff, like vocal wise.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like, but to be fair for him, I think it's obviously more of like homage parody stuff than like.
Yeah, I think he's like, a little bit more campier about it.
Instead of like, I'm so fucking badass, I'm gonna sound like this. I don't really think Rob Zombie's quite like that.
On that early White Zombie stuff, though, he sounds like Gigi Allen, like young Gigi Allen.
He does. But speaking of things that don't sound like young Gigi Allen, so the next song on here is Law and Order. This is a song obviously about police brutality that I think still rings true to this day because nothing changes.
Yeah. It's good. Nice kind of anthemic chorus. Law and Order, they don't do what they oughta. Good song. As you said, relevant as ever. It'll never change. If you like the rest of this album, you'll like Law and Order. That's about all I have to say about it.
No, totally fair. And then Rough Trade. So you said this was not about the actual record label Rough Trade. It was about a different record label.
So yes, here's the whole story with this. So SLF become SLF very quickly. They adopt punk because of the Clash, all that shit, like I said. They release their first single, which is usually included on the CD reissues of Inflammable Material. So the A-side is an earlier version of Suspect Device. That's pretty close to this one. Maybe the album version's a little tighter. And the B-side is a track that's not on this album called 78 RPM, which I'm glad they didn't feel the need to re-record it for this album. It's good. I like it. If you like SLF, you'll like it. But it's just, an anthemic statement of purpose song that is not as good as Suspect Device or Wasted Life in that regard. So they do that single, and it does really well, right? It does really well, of course, in Ireland, where, punk hasn't really taken hold yet. There's SLF and a few other bands, including Protex and The Undertones. But John Peel, the great tastemaker of British rock and roll, basically from the 60s onward, just like someone in the mainstream who is very influential, who is constantly looking for cool new music. He loves Suspect Device. He plays it over and over. So SLF end up getting a lot of attention, and this record label called Island reaches out to them and says, oh, because of your single, we want to sign you. We're gonna make you rock stars. And at the time, 79, it was conceivable that you could be in a punk band and become like a rock star. It happened to the Pistols in their way before they broke up. It certainly happened to the Clash and to the Jam. Like in Britain, you could be like a star and be in punk rock at that time. There was a few years where that was possible. Island are talking it up. They'd written up a contract with the members of SLF, all this shit. And they're blowing a lot of smoke up their ass. And they tell every member of SLF, they're like, hey, you need to come relocate to London right now for us to make this happen. The guys in SLF at this point still have day jobs. They quit their day jobs and they moved out of their homes in Northern Ireland. And the unemployment rate in Northern Ireland at this point was over 35%. So to quit your job was no small thing. There was a chance that you weren't going to get another job. So this record label basically convinced them to leave their life behind. They put all their money into relocating to England for this label, who they then get there and the label gets cold feet and says, actually, we're backing out. We don't think you have the commercial viability. We said you did. You're stuck there. They have to, for a time, kind of in a panic, return to Ireland and go like, okay, like, what do we do? And there was a moment where they were considering breaking up the band because they were just like, we might have to just go back to work. We might have blown it. Of course, they end up getting, meeting the people who become the basis for Rough Trade Records. As I said, Rough Trade, very influential, more in post-punk than in punk overall. Huge underground label for the UK. And Rough Trade, is formed and agrees to put out their album. But they write a song about this experience with Island Records. And then just probably to avoid legal troubles, they call it Rough Trade. They say they thought maybe the guys at Rough Trade would be upset, but they thought it was funny. So it let them get off the thing off their chest about Island Records fucking them over. It also seems like a funny little punk rock contrarian thing. Like, oh, they're so punk, they wrote a song telling their own label to fuck off. But that's the story with that song.
Kind of a win for win, if you think about it. A win-win situation.
It's another, again, it's a great punk rock song. If you like SLF, if you like the first Clash album, you'll like it, I think.
No, totally. And then the next song on here is by far the longest, which was a cover of Johnny Was. Now, this is a great fucking cover. I liked this thing a lot.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, especially for 1979 and obviously even into the 80s. Punk bands doing 8-minute long songs, not really a thing.
Yeah.
Even for a cover, not really a thing.
Yeah. It became even weirder in the 80s with the emergence of hardcore, but even at this point, pretty crazy. This is a great cover. It's a Bob Marley cover. I don't know. I assume Bob Marley wrote it. Maybe someone had done it before, but it's a Wailers song. Just a couple notes about this. First of all, this is the only other point in this record. As I'd said, the guys in SLF do have roots in like heavy metal cock rock stuff. Thin Lizzy they carry over, but they were also into shit like UFO and things. And this is a big moment where you see this. The first half of this song has a lot of kind of guitar heroics that, Stiff Little Fingers didn't necessarily do a lot. The other thing that I thought while listening to the song is British punk bands enjoyed a close relationship with island music, with ska and with reggae. There's political reasons for this. There's social reasons for this. There are just musical reasons for it, that they were both up-tempo types of music that were very based on shouted communicative vocals. The Clash famously on their first album, they did Police and Thieves, which is also very long for a punk song. It's a cover of, I can't remember who the original is even by, God help me. But it's about 6 minutes long. So pretty long for a punk song. I think that Stiff Little Fingers specifically are tipping the hat to Bob Marley, but also to the Clash, saying, well, we're going to do a punked up reggae song. That was kind of a way that you could show racial solidarity in punk, I think. I think that was the means of doing that, was to be like, we're going to cover this song by a black artist. We're going to cover it in our own style, but with a lot of reference. And it's going to be about something important that we can relate to, that they can relate to. And it's kind of a way of signifying what side you're on. Because, of course, at the same time of the Clash, and even more so by 79 with, SLF's time, the National Front and Martin Weber had infiltrated the punk scene pretty severely. So it was important to make declarations like that.
Well, and that was the whole, and I don't think that was quite the impetus. That was Eric Clapton, but that was like a lot of the impetus between Rock Against Racism and stuff like that, right?
Oh, yeah. Just no, you're right. You're right. It is the Eric Clapton thing and the David Bowie thing, but it'd been bubbling up for a while. And for the Clash specifically said, in their first few years, people thought they were a National Front band. Their first single was called White Riot, which explicitly is about saying there was, I hate to say, a race riot. There was a protest that turned violent in, I think, is it Notting Hill? And Joe Strummer and Mick Jones were saying see, black people are in this position where they have to fight for themselves. And white people are afraid to fight with them. They're afraid to be part of the riot because they were so trained to be polite, And so White Riot is about is a call to arms for that. Be like, hey, this is important. You need to fight for it. But the lyrics are shouted and a lot of people just heard White Riot. I want a riot of my own. And so they specifically played Rock Against Racism because they were so sick of people misunderstanding that song.
Interesting. I mean, that obviously makes a lot of sense, especially when people call you something that you're not. You want to set the fucking record straight,
yeah,
for sure.
Well, and of course they believed in it too. It's not like they only did
for
it
sure.
But you know what I mean? They were like, well, we have to make clear to everyone once and for all where we stand. Because I guess the Sickles and Hammers and Red Stars didn't make it clear enough.
Yeah. Well, speking of all those things, I think it leads perfectly into the penultimate song, which is also the most, I would say, probably most listened to song on this album, which is Alternative Ulster, or at least one of the most listened to.
Yes.
Now, this song is obviously maybe the most specifically about the Troubles. There's nothing for us in Belfast. We ain't got nothing, but they don't really care. They don't even know, we just want money. Alternative Ulster, a lot of this stuff going on here.
Yeah.
And you were talking about, obviously, about an alternative to the violence, alternative to the sectarian sectarianism. That's essentially what the song is about. It seems like a rallying cry for the idea that there's something more than just violence and sectarian conflict.
Yeah. So this is, to me, the real climax of this album. We have all these songs that talk about the state of living during the Troubles, in the Troubles. We have Wasted Life and Suspect of Vice, which is very aggressive and that's like a call to like fight for yourself. And Wasted Life, which is pretty bleak. All these songs, Law and Order and Here We Are Nowhere. And that culminates into Alternative Ulster, which is also, again, the most specifically about the Troubles, but also a little bit more optimistic. Or it is like, we are going to create for ourselves a pathway that doesn't involve like being dead children or killing other children. The phrase Alternative Ulster actually comes from a zine. It was the first Irish punk zine. And Jake Burns was so glad that things like that were starting to happen in Ireland that he used the phrase for his song.
That's very interesting because, like, it's one of those things where I assume, obviously, there was a lot of countering towards the sectarian, like, conflict to it, but I'm surprised they didn't come up with it themselves. I mean, Alternative Ulster is obviously so perfect. Just a great phrase. It is so perfect. Yeah, it is so perfect.
It's so perfect for them and their themes. Exactly. Yeah, I had the same thought. So, I mean, I love about 8 of the songs on this album, but I would say that there's, let's say, like 4 songs that are indisputable punk classics. Let's narrow it to 3. So there is Suspect of Vice, Wasted Life, and Alternative Ulster. Those are all like essential punk songs. This is, like you said, this is pretty clearly the most famous SLF song as well. Again, I think because it's so catchy, it's so optimistic sounding in the face of like basically like living in hell, living in this like Armageddon where there seems to be no future, is just, as you put it, it's a rallying cry for something else. A cringe millennial thing I'm going to say about this song is ever since I heard it in middle school, and of course I can't relate on a specific level to these lyrics, I project whatever I project onto them, but the part that goes, they say they're a part of you and that's not true, that always gets me pretty emotional. There's something about that line and that feeling and like applying that to, I guess like where I grew up and how I am now, that really hits for me. It's just, they say they were a part of you and that's not true. I don't know why, but it gets me a little choked up every time I hear it.
No, very understandable. And, speaking of Brian, I think it leads into our final song here, which is called Closed Groove. Now, this is, I think you and I both agree, not a favorite of ours on this album.
No.
But I will say, though, the lyrics, though, are incredibly elderly millennial. So it goes...
Yes, they are.
Punctuality, waste of time. Now nostalgia is past its prime. History's a thing of the past. Being first just cannot last. Beep, beep, I'm an answering machine. That's a millennial's favorite friend because they don't have to talk on the phone.
They don't have to talk on the phone, exactly.
I mean, to say what I mean. Beep, beep, I've got very strong views. Plug in any loop tape you choose. My single fault is modesty. I'm changing my views consistently.
Yeah, I mean, so probably my least favorite song on the album, but I do love these lyrics. In general, Jake Burns, I think, had really excellent lyrics, better in a literary sense than most of his peers, but I think these are great lyrics.
But it is obviously very much a millennial rallying cry, but they were just like 20 years too early for it.
It's just about not being able to commit to anything and feeling internal contradictions all the time.
And that is definitely the millennials' greatest problem, I would say.
This song is pretty different, right? It's not really a punk song in the normal sense. It features literally kind of a locked groove on the rhythm section and these weird kind of dissonant guitar noises.
You can even say closed groove.
Yeah, exactly. I assume that they were thinking of that when they chose that title. But yeah, very repetitive and minimal beat, dissonant kind of ching-ching guitars. And the vocals are just, it's very new wavy, spoken word staccato, very different from how Jake Burns normally sings. It kind of deflates the album's ending to me because Alternative Ulster is so climactic.
I agree. It's just like with horror, right? They really
there has to be one.
Just have to be like a rallying cry, and that should be the last song. Just like with that horror album, they kind of shit the bed on that.
So I like that this song is on this album for a contextual reason. When I'm listening to the whole album, I always listen to it because I've listened to it all. I don't hate the song. It just kind of is whatever for me. The reason it exists, right, is because 79, a lot of people were already saying, if you can believe that, punk is dead, punk has been dead by 79. What you're seeing is a lot of, what we call post-punk now. It's a lot of these bands that are coming out of punk and they're doing artsier things, they're doing more minimal or avant-garde things, obviously Joy Division, but also, and I think that's reflected here, bands like Gang of Four and The Fall, which had a lot of influence from krautrock, had a lot of influence from Can and Neu, and especially Kraftwerk, and were kind of taking the confrontational aspect of punk and making it, again, more minimal, more avant-garde, more abstract. And I kind of think that Closed Crew is maybe because Stiff Little Fingers heard Gang of Four or The Fall. And we're like, okay, that's what's going on overseas now. That's what's going on in the UK. And I'm glad this track is on there because it does kind of demonstrate that they were kind of keeping abreast of like changes happening in punk, because the rest of this album is very 77 sounding. I know to millennials and to Zoomers, 77, 79, what's the big difference? But music and culture changed so much faster back then. So when this album came out, people referred to it as sounding old because it sounded like a 77 punk album in 79. And it does, and it's great for that. But I do think that Closed Groove, you know, it at least demonstrates that they were capable of other things, and they were going to expand on that kind of simple 77 punk song, which they did to better effect on their later albums. So I'm not mad at the track, but the album should end with Alternative Ulster.
No, totally agree. All right, but yes, so that is the track listing here. So getting into our final thoughts here, I like this album quite a bit. I think it's obviously a great companion piece to Michael Collins and other Irish media we're certainly going to be talking about. It was cool hearing the perspective of an unfortunately still colonized population and one that went through decades of sectarian conflict that didn't need to happen. I think that the perspective of trying to see a non-sectarian way through it was interesting. Once again, I like most of the tracks on here. A lot of them are like all-time great punk songs, and if you're just a big fan of, you know, late 70s, early 80s punk music, I think this is a great album to throw on.
Yeah, I gotta second all that. I picked this specifically to complement the Michael Collins episode because, again, it would be a lighter sort of episode. You know, we're just talking about an album. But I thought it would add some interesting emotional texture to talking about the Troubles, in addition to like the more like history accurate things, that episodes that we've been doing at your behest, Taylor. Just the idea that you're hearing from these very working class kids in Northern Ireland who are just trying to live their lives in the midst of the Troubles is very interesting to me, that they're just writing about their lives and it happens to capture this moment in time. Musically, I'd say it's pretty essential. If you're into punk rock, like I'm gonna say 8 of the, what is it, the 13 tracks on here or whatever?
13 tracks.
8 of these 13 tracks to me are like peak punk rock, 77, like late 70s punk. But particularly Suspect Device, Wasted Life, Barbed Wire Love, and Alternative Ulster, they're songs that anyone that's into punk rock should know. In fact, I'm gonna go even further. If you're like a big Green Day fan, maybe you're not even like punk or whatever, if you love like 90s Green Day, you should probably check out Inflammable Material because it's as important to their sound as, like, I don't know, Bad Religion or something, in my opinion.
No, absolutely, 100%. All right, and then let's get to our pluggables here, and then we'll have our final thoughts as always. So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And then as well, please follow and subscribe to us on both our YouTube and our Spotify channel, where we upload every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well as always, please support our good friends Scott, Sean, and Robert. Of course, they are not 70s punks. You know, they didn't grow up in Belfast, but they do need our monetary and moral support here. So
they are DIY.
They are very DIY, though, yes. So please, once again, support our good friend Scott, Sean, Robert on their very ambitious new project. You know, the first episode is on YouTube if you want to check it out. But once again, they need more money. They need more moral support to help continue on the series. I think they were talking about making 10 episodes total.
Maybe we should review the episode that's out soon.
Yes. And then as well, if you donate to the campaign and just, let us know, send us an email, of course, comment on YouTube that you donated, we will, within reason, match your donation, like $20-25. Do not donate $10,000 because we will not match that donation.
Yeah, I literally cannot.
Yes.
Do not own me.
Those are exactly. So those are my pluggables. Go ahead, Brian.
Follow us at Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram and Threads. The accounts are tied. Spending more and more time on Threads because other social media, well, Threads is pretty bad, but it's not unusable. But that's where I talk about pop culture most lately. So find me both at Millennials Are Old Pod, or find us at Millennials Are Old Pod, and me at JLo Biafra on Threads. So you can follow Millennials Are Old on Facebook, where, again, I have a list of Boomer and Gen X groups, mostly Boomer groups that I follow, where they post some pretty funny stuff. And every once in a while, they post something genuinely pretty interesting as a little time capsule.
Hell yeah, good to know, man. Let me tell you what, I hope to God that unionists find this video and just explode our comment section. I really hope
that'd be so awesome.
I want to see some cringe unionists.
I mean, they can't be too hard to find.
That's the thing. I think they're not super common online in my experience, because whenever I find sectarian like stuff on YouTube, like documentaries and stuff, it's almost always nationalists that post on the comment sections, which I find very interesting. I don't know why, but I find that very
interesting.
I find very few unionists posting online, which is probably for the best in my opinion.
Well, that also probably has to do with like the spheres that you exist in online, Taylor. I also don't see very many Stormfront posters online.
I do, Brian, because those are my best. No, I'm just kidding, actually.
Those are my boys. We don't agree on anything, but you know.
You don't have to agree on everything to be friends.
Yeah, people need to get over their divisiveness.
Well, you know, speaking of get over our divisiveness and our sectarian conflict, Brian, I think in a little bit, I am going to be divisive and go to sleep. You know, I am choosing that sectarian conflict here versus awaken
I am
sleep.
going to be a loyalist and be loyal to getting to bed at a reasonable time because I'm a sleepy millennial.
I'm going to be a nationalist and make my own nation state in my bedroom as I fall asleep.
That's the dream, man.
I feel like that's the dream of basically every elderly millennial, is just to be able to sleep. I think that.
Yeah, just to have a sovereign nation that's your bed that you never have to leave, like John Lennon.
But yeah, so, and you know, I want to say before we cut the episode here, obviously, of course, we do our little bits about going to sleep. But once again, Brian, I think you and I can agree, right? I think if we ever take a vacation, we're absolutely going to Belfast and going to the unionist side and harassing them. Would you do that with me?
So I would love to see Ireland. I would love to. If I leave the country, it's probably the first place I want to see.
I only really spent time in Dublin last time, but I would 100% be willing to go to Belfast, because getting to Belfast from Dublin actually isn't that hard. I think it's like a 4-hour bus ride from the Dublin airport, so it's not that bad. Yeah. So maybe next time I go to Ireland, I'll go to Belfast, just because I want to check it out, because it seems like an interesting city, sectarian conflict aside.
Yeah.
Which the violence really isn't going on anymore, thank God, but, you know, it theoretically could start up again, and then at that point, Brian, then we'll get to live our Brace Belden dream of going to doing a sectarian
we can die there instead of in the water wars.
Oh, geez. I mean, Northern Ireland is having their own water wars at the moment, so yeah, it's not great. And you want to know whose fault that was? It was the British fault. Would you believe it, Brian?
It always is. They're pigs. They're scum.
I think we can agree that when it comes to drawing borders, the UK has never failed. They are always really good at it.
They've always been good for themselves. Yes.
All right, but once again, so speaking of drawing lines, I'm going to draw the line in the sand and say this is the end of the episode because I need to go to sleep because I'm an old-ass piece of shit millennial. So you know what? Have a good night, Brian, and I hope you're able to have your own sectarian conflict in your own bedroom.
Likewise. Good night, Taylor.
Hell yeah, have a good night, everybody.